Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, guys. We're getting into today World War One, a new kind of war, as we call it. We're going to be looking at what the war was actually like and the weapons that were being used at this time. We talked a little bit the other day about getting into the war itself. That we weren't sure what to expect. They thought this was going to be this glorifying thing where they're going to go off to war, they're going to line up on the field of battle and shoot at each other, and then you're going to go home and you're going to be a hero. But that's not what war was like anymore. Since the last major war in Europe, there was industrialization, and that changes everything when we have machines and industrialized weapons being used now. And so let's take a look, guys, at the realities of World War One here. Most of World War One ends up being fought as in a style of warfare we call trench warfare, which basically means because the other side has machine guns and the ability to shoot so many rounds of ammunition per second per minute, you couldn't stand and shoot at each other anymore, right? Guns were too advanced at this point. And so what ends up happening is most militaries and what ends up happening on the Western Front specifically is the armies dig down into the ground. And so most trenches that were dug were about 6 feet deep. And what ends up happening is it's pretty cold. The water table is actually pretty close to the surface. And so a lot of times they'd be wet. If it rained, it got wet. They had to bail these trenches out. And so these guys spent a lot of time in very cold, damp trenches, basically digging these holes so that they could survive. What ends up happening, too, is a lot of people, if you go over the trench, you end up in this territory called no man's land between the two sides that are fighting. And so in no man's land, the idea is that if you're in that area, you're not going to survive there, most likely. You're going to be gunned down by the other side, or even worse, you might run into some barbed wire that was laid out by their side. You might blow up from mines and other aspects that we have here in at this point. We'll talk about some of those weapons later on. All right, so it was not a good situation. Things were pretty rough, pretty bad for the war here. Again, they thought they were going off and that this war was going to be really quick. They'd be home by Christmas is the idea. All right, this war started in the summer. They said, hey, we'll be home by Christmas. It'll be a quick war. It will be glorified. We'll all be heroes when we come home. But that's not what happened. This war dragged on for years, and they weren't home for Christmas, and a lot of people died. And this is one of those situations where they didn't know what to expect. And so we can kind of look at the network of trenches that were created. So this is supposed to be both sides here. You can see the front line of the trenches there. And again, the trenches were kind of dug zigzag like that because you didn't want the enemy getting into your trench if it was a straight line and then just shooting down the trench and killing everyone. So they had these zigzag trenches. And again, the goal was to leave your trench, get to the other side and take the trench to the other side so you can continue to make more and more progress and push the enemy out or push the enemy back. The problem is because of the warfare that was happening, we end up in a stalemate. And neither side's really moving. No, there is no push, right? The trenches aren't changing, all right, and they're not moving to new territory exactly. And so you've got all these trenches that become very well established, not just a front line trench, but you've got these support trenches and communication trenches, and you've got reserve trenches and trenches that go back to the headquarters of that area. And so you get this elaborate system of these dugout trenches. All right, now if you look closely, you've got no man's land in the middle, and you can see you've got all these kind of like craters and pock marks all over it. That's because they also started using shelling. All right, so they would shell from the other side, and they would send these basically bombs right over the other side, and so survival was very difficult in a lot of these places. In some places, the trenches were really well established, right? They had time to establish these nice trenches. You can see it's probably it's not 6 feet deep. It's probably about 4 or 5. But then they've got this nice kind of wooden planks that they put up there so you can shoot right through as well. And that's the German side. You can see because they're wearing their Pickelauber helmets, the helmets with the spikes on them. All right. In other places, though, the trenches were not very well defined. In fact, if you look at this photo here, that you can hardly even see where the trench is, right? You can see that the guys are kind of laying in the trench a little bit. It's definitely not a 6 foot deep trench. And in some places, the lines, the opposing trenches were very close to one another. Like you could very easily stick your head up and shoot the other side. You could even hear them talking or in some cases singing. And in some places, it was far enough away where you couldn't really see or hear the other side. All right, so you have some places very well established, some places not very well established, like you see here. Here's another one, guys. We look at just the cold. So most of these troops that came in, again, they came in the summer, especially right off the bat, and they thought they'd be home before Christmas. As the war dragged on, it became very evident that they wouldn't be home before Christmas, and they weren't coming home most likely that year. And they weren't. Most of them were not dressed for the weather. They didn't have the clothes, and they didn't have the supplies they needed. This became a war of attrition. Basically, whatever side could win out or wait out the other side in the long run. They kept sending people over the top, and basically what would happen if you had to go over the top is most likely you were killed. Mass casualties if you had to go over the top of the trench and go fight the other side. And so this became one of those stalemate, long-running wars, and a lot of times they didn't have the supplies or the weather clothing that they needed for the proper weather, I should say. One of the things that resulted in this long trench warfare was what we call is trench foot. And I know you probably don't want to look at that. I can take that off in a minute. But the idea of trench foot is if your feet are never dry, this is what happens. And so they always said that one of the most important things for a soldier was to make sure that your feet are dry. So they would wear multiple pairs of socks each day, making sure that they were always staying dry. Because if your skin is never dry, it basically starts to decay. And so this is some pretty bad examples of trench foot, but it happened pretty commonly. And that's largely because I'll go off that and we'll continue to talk about it, but largely because the trench was wet and it would rain, and the rain would basically flood the trench. They'd have to bail it out, and those guys had a hard time keeping their skin dry over those large extended periods of time. So when we look at, like we say, when you go over the top, usually what would happen is you'd be commanded to go over the top. You'd hear a whistle blow, and that meant it was time to get up and go over the top of the trench and go out and fight. Again, the problem is you probably got mowed down. You can see that this guy, unfortunately, met his match, and he ended up running into some barbed wire there. So each side of the trench would have barbed wire in certain places so that people from the other side couldn't get into the trench. And so he ran into that barbed wire and most likely got caught up in that and then probably shot afterward. So you can see living conditions deteriorated very rapidly. We have massive casualties, massive amounts of death. And you can see that the men that were surviving at this time were living amongst dead bodies. They were living amongst their buddies that had died. In a lot of cases, they didn't have the opportunity to get their bodies and bury them. When they finally did have those opportunities, they did that. And we see mass graves happening, but it was a pretty bad situation overall. All right, this was not what people signed up for. Again, they were looking for that militarism, that glorification of war, and that's not what they got. Right? They very quickly got the horrors of what industrialized warfare looks like, mass death, basically. We also get to the idea of shell attacks. So they would have these very large guns, basically, that they would shell the other side. So they lob these large shells up over the other side so that they'd hit the trenches, so that then you could get up and run over to the other side and hopefully take the trench and make headway and try to take territory from the other side. And so they would do these massive shelling attacks before they would go over the top to try to take over the other side. And so it led to these massive deaths. Eventually, we're going to see that they start putting things like poisonous gas in some of these shells as well, which we'll get to in a little bit, the idea of poisonous gas. For the most part, we look at there's not a lot of individual battles for World War I, and that's largely because it was a stalemate. One of the largest battles, if we look at specific areas that were fought here and battles that were fought, is the Battle of Verdun, and thousands of people were killed at this battle. You can see here's just this is behind the trench here, and you can see that they were taking the bodies and burying them in these kind of mass graves. They were putting up the headstone markers, essentially. The crosses there to kind of denote where those bodies were being kept or being buried, but massive casualties, massive death, like we said, from these shell attacks, from going over the top, and just in general. This is kind of the last time we see the people in charge, the generals and the higher ups, their massive disregard for life. Right? It didn't matter how many people were dying. It was, we need to gain more territory. We need to gain more land. We need to try to break the stalemate. So send more guys over the top of the trench. And we see just this massive death going on at this time because of it. You can see here another person. This body was blown all the way up into a tree after a shell attack. All right, shell attacks again, pretty common. Here, the guys were having a hard time getting their rations. Again, if you they didn't always have the food that they needed. We'll talk more about some of the countries, specifically like Germany. We'll talk about and how they were not really prepared for this war. They again, everyone thought this was going to be a quick war, so they didn't have the resources and supplies they needed for this long, extended period of time, this 4-year long war. And so it was hard to get some of these supplies to the troops and to the military. And these guys took the into their own hands and decided that they would find their own tasty meal. And so you can see they did a little hunting. And if you look close enough, those that's not like it's not things that you normally would go hunt. Those are actually rats. And if you look closely, you're like, wow, those are really big rats. They look like they're squirrels or maybe something bigger. Yeah, they're big rats because think about it, guys. What have they been eating? All right. You can't always go get those dead bodies of people that die in no man's land. Those rats were eating people, right? The decaying dead bodies of people. And so that's why they're so big. They've been very well fed for years at this point because of the war. Right. I know that's disgusting, but again, these guys needed to survive as well. So what does it come down to, guys? The results of trench warfare. Living conditions were awful. You just saw a number of examples of that, right? Harsh living conditions, horrible death, and just the conditions themselves, the wet, the increased ability for you with trench foot and other aspects. Obviously, you're living in amongst rats and dead bodies, so disease was pretty rampant. And like we said, there's really no victories here. It's stalemate. There's thousands of miles of trench dug specifically on the western front between France and Germany here. And there's not a whole lot of movement. No one's gaining any land. And that's where we get to this idea of this true stalemate. It became this war of attrition. Whichever side can outlast the other side is going to win. And that's really what became the biggest issue. Second part we have, guys, today, we're going to take a quick look at new weapons. And so there are a number of new weapons that came out at this time that we'll get into right now. All right, so what made this war different from past wars is the idea of industrialization. And so when we talk about industrialization and maybe the most impressive, biggest gun is the machine, or biggest weapon is the machine gun. All right, the machine gun became very important for this time period, largely because this is how you kind of stop the other side from getting across. It was the easiest way to mow down as many people as you could. All right, now machine gunners here, they call them machine gun nests. They had a pretty short lifespan because if you were in there, that was kind of the first thing the enemy was trying to take out. Because if they didn't take out the machine gun, they had no chance of getting across no man's land. Okay. The next major weapon that we see coming out of World War I is the beginning of tanks. All right, tanks started out as a way to kind of cross no man's land safely, and over time they became more and more elaborate. So you can see, like these tanks here, a lot of tanks started out as kind of like one-man tanks. These ones are larger tanks, and you can see that they don't have cannons or anything on the front like we're used to seeing. But tanks became a way for us to safely try to get across no man's land or help escort men, like you can see here, across no man's land to hopefully get to the other side. All right. We know today tanks have become much more important. World War II, they become much more important as well. Another one we have here is submarines, called U-boats by the Germans. They became really important, increasingly important, because Germany was basically blockading Britain and France from getting any supplies from, say, the United States. All right, and so they were trying to blockade the rest of Europe from getting supplies to aid them in the war. And so they used the U-boats, and the U-boat wolf packs, as they're called, were basically out hunting throughout the Atlantic Ocean. And it got to the point where they started what they called unrestricted warfare, meaning that if there were any ships out there, if they believed that they were en route to Britain or to France, they would sink them. All right, and so we'll talk more about unrestricted warfare and how that leads eventually to the United States getting involved. Two that are a little bit less common were gas and flamethrowers. Gas is much more common. Flamethrowers a little bit less common during World War I, but they also come from this time period. Poisonous gas became a huge issue, and eventually it will lead to to basically being outlawed. There are rules to engagement, rules to war that the world has kind of agreed to, and gas is eventually outlawed after World War One. But different forms of gas, mustard gas was probably the most common, chlorine gas, other gases. Basically, what they would do is if sometimes they shot them over in shells and the gas would go off, come out of the shell. But when they first started using it, they made sure the wind was pointing in the right direction. They would just open up these gas barrels basically and let the gas go into the air, and it was disturbing. It was a very difficult thing to fight, and so that's where we start to get the gas masks that were being invented. Um, and think about it, like if you can't necessarily see the cloud of gas coming, and all of a sudden you can't breathe, or your throat or your eyes are on fire, or it led to terrible issues after the war as well. And that's one of the reasons why gas and chemical weapons have been banned from use in warfare. All right. Flamethrowers, like I said, became a little bit more common, but not as common as we'll see like in World War II later on. All right. The use of flamethrowers. Maybe the most impressive and the best of all of these new weapons that we see being used at this time is the airplane. All right, airplanes had not been invented a whole lot earlier than World War One, and so when we start to see airplanes being used, they began as basically someone would go up in an airplane and they were used as reconnaissance. They would look down on the other side so they could see the trench and see what was happening, and then they would kind of report back to their headquarters so they would know when they could fight or what the other side looked like, and they could figure things out. Eventually, they became more fighting, and we'll see airplanes being used not just as fighters, but eventually as bombers during World War One as well. And so things adapted, or things changed very quickly. We have a couple of examples. We have the British fighter here, was called the Sopwith Camel, and this became a favorite of British aces. Now, to be an ace, you have to have 5 confirmed air kills. So that means you've shot down 5 enemies. That's what made you an ace. And so that was kind of rare territory, largely because most of these fighter pilots died very young. I think the average age of most fighter pilots was about 26. All right, so it was a pretty dangerous job, and so if you look at the British aircraft here, they had about a 2-hour range, so they could fly for about 2 hours. They went about 118 miles an hour, and they had mounted guns on the wings. Eventually, that became one of the things that became an issue. Is some of them did have mounted guns like on the nose here as well, and they had to figure out how to engineer it so that the gun would shoot and not shoot the propeller off. But they did figure it out, right? They had a way that the gun would kind of a slight little choke in it so that it wouldn't shoot the propeller off every time you shot the gun. Okay. So it's just some of the tips on flying a Sopwith. Eventually, we're going to see the art of dog fighting happen, and so you can see that some of the things that went along with this. You wanted to make sure you wore warm clothing because obviously it's an open cockpit. You're open to all the elements, so it was cold when you're up in the air. Make sure you fasten your seatbelt, especially if you have to make evasive maneuvers. All of a sudden, you'd end up falling out of your airplane. They always wore a silk scarf, and that was just kind of protect their neck and make sure that it was easy to kind of rotate your head around because you had to be able to see where you were going and see what was behind you. When you were airborne, you had to be sure to handle things carefully. There's a rotary engine inside it, and so that rotary engine creates a lot of torque effect, and so it's very easy for you to swerve off course if you let go of the controls. So you had to hold on all the time, and because that engine was rotating and how it worked, a lot of times you'd get castor oil flying off the engine, so you had to wear typically goggles to protect your eyes, and you always wanted to have your map with you because if you get lost, you are pretty much screwed. You have no idea where you're going. You are in trouble. Right. Eventually, what we're going to see is the dogfights start to occur, and that's where you have airplanes fighting each other in the sky. And so the Sopwith, specifically the British airplane, it wasn't as fast as the German, what they called the German Fokker, which was their main aircraft, but they were more maneuverable, so they were able to kind of loop around and stay behind the enemy at all costs, so they could kind of spin and get in the right position. And when they said when you went for the kill, then you need to shut off your throttle and dive straight down at the enemy and just open fire. All right. The idea was to either kill the pilot or shoot down the plane itself. And the British had a saying is beware the Hun in the sun. All right. The Hun was kind of the derogatory term they used for the Germans, but the idea was the Hun in the sun was a lot of times the German fighter pilots would attack from outside, like coming out of the sun, so that you couldn't see them coming. All right. One thing that we still see going on at this time that's different from other areas of the warfare during World War I was there was still a lot of chivalry that happened in the sky. The idea was you never attacked a pilot who was still on the ground. You never attacked a pilot who was disabled in the sky. So there was kind of this act of chivalry that we see, going back to the idea of the code of knights, right? The chivalric code. All right. So that still happened in the skies at this time too. You can see some of the equipment that was on the Sopwith or on the airplane for the British. You can see they had their Bentley engine, so it was a Bentley engine inside there. They had their machine guns mounted on there, their goggles, their map case, their coats so they could stay warm, their boots to stay warm, their wolfskin gloves to stay warm, their silk scarf to stay warm. You'll notice there's one really important piece of equipment that's missing here, and that's if you get in trouble, there is no parachute. They did not have parachutes. They didn't really exist yet, and so if you end up having an issue with your plane, you basically have two options. You take the plane down to the ground and hope you survive, or you can jump out and hope you survive. And so it got to the point where a lot of pilots started bringing a handgun with them as well. And so that was if your plane caught fire or there was an issue where your plane was going down, they could take the easy way out and they would shoot themselves before they got to the ground. All right. Again, average age was about 26 for most of these pilots. They did not live very long. Looking at the German aircraft here, this was the one that was most commonly going against the British Sopwith, the Fokker. And so when we look at the German dogfighter, it was a little bit faster, had a little less range, still had those two mounted machine guns. You can see it had different versions too. They had a single wing, they had a bi-wing, and a tri-wing that were used. That tri-wing might look really familiar to you. That is a pretty famous aircraft here, made famous by this man and his group of fighters. His name is Manfred von Richthofen, but you probably know him as the Red Baron. He is basically the greatest fighter pilot to ever have lived. All right. Again, to become an ace, you had to have 5 confirmed kills. He had over 70. All right. And he became such a great pilot that he ended up painting his plane red. And the idea for that was he was so good that he was inviting the enemy to come find him easier in the sky. All right. By being bright red like that. In fact, he eventually gained a command of a group of other fighter pilots that they called themselves the Flying Circus because they all painted their planes in all these super bright different colors, basically inviting the enemy to come find them. And they were all amazing pilots. All right. And so unfortunately for the Red Baron, a great story for the Red Baron. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly how he died, but we're pretty positive, historically looking at it, that he was shot down from the ground. It sounds like a ground soldier saw him flying by and ended up shooting up at him and ended up killing him, and that's what crashed his aircraft. So that's unfortunate for an amazing pilot like he is, but a very interesting story of the Red Baron and the Flying Circus. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed looking at kind of unfortunately, the horrors of war, but then also getting into the new weapons, things that you will definitely need to know for our test. Have a good one, guys, and we'll see you again soon.